Stage actress Victoria Ann Barry was supposed to meet her co-star Bob Crane, famously known for the CBS sitcom Hogan's Heroes, for a lunch date in which he did not show up for. Barry knew Crane often slept late due to his late nights at the theater and visiting the local nightclubs. While it was not out of character, Barry still wanted to check on her co-star. When she arrived at his apartment, she found his door unlocked. Stepping inside the darkened rooms, she made numerous calls to Bob, but received no answer. When she made her way towards his bedroom, she found the door open and saw what appeared to be someone lying in bed. At first, she thought it might be a female companion who spent the night with her co-star. But as she got closer, she realized she was not looking at a sleeping female, but a dead body. That body would be revealed to be Bob Crane. Not just dead, but beaten to death with some sort of blunt object, and was strangled with an electrical cord that was still tied around his neck. Robert Edward Crane, born July 13, 1928, in Waterbury, Connecticut. Most famously known as Colonel Robert Hogan from the CBS television series Hogan's Heroes, which aired from 1965 to 1971. Crane's early career began in radio in the 1950s. Due to his popularity, he was moved to the CBS station in Los Angeles to host their morning show, where he interviewed guests such as Marilyn Monroe, Bob Hope, and Frank Sinatra. Crane became one of the #1 DJs in Los Angeles. From there, he pursued an acting career that led him to making guest appearances on shows such as The Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. After Carl Reiner appeared on his radio show, Crane managed to persuade Reiner to book him on The Dick Van Dyke Show. This led to his landing a regular role on The Donna Reed Show from 1963 to 1965. It was in that same year he was handpicked by the CBS network to take the title role in the prisoner of war sitcom Hogan's Heroes. It was during his time on Hogan's he connected with a friend of fellow cast member Richard Dawson, a man named John Carpenter. No relation to the Halloween director. Carpenter was a regional sales manager for Sony Corp and had been introducing their new line of home entertainment equipment, then known as VTRs, videotape recorders. Carpenter often worked with celebrities, installing their home video and audio equipment. This was nearly 15 years before your average person could afford to buy a VCR. Through Richard Dawson, Crane and Carpenter began to become friends. they started visiting local bars and strip clubs where people would recognize Crane from the television show. Often Crane could be found sitting in and drumming for the house band as a gag. It was at this time Carpenter began to introduce himself to women in the clubs as Bob Crane's manager. Then the women would be convinced to go to Carpenter's place for a party, where Crane and Carpenter would engage in sex with them and videotape their encounters. Crane, who was already an avid photographer, immediately took a genuine interest in the concept of VTRs. The main appeal to Crane capturing his sexual adventures on tape was that video could be shot straight from the camera and not require any film processing, so there would never be the risk of their exploits being witnessed by a nosy lab tech. And if there ever was a concern, the tape could easily be erased. All during this time, Crane was living two lives. One in which he, along with John Carpenter, indulged in dark sexual fantasies with the women they picked up in nightclubs. And the other, as a married church-going man with 3 children. It would only be a matter of time before these two worlds would collide and eventually end in murder. Often today, people wonder, how is it that women went so readily with Crane and Carpenter? To understand that is to recognize that by the time Hogan's was a hit, America was in the middle of the swinging 60s. Attitudes towards sex and marriage had begun to change completely from where they were at the beginning of the decade. And by 1967, more than 80% of America had televisions in their homes. TV was a very powerful medium with far more influence than radio and movies. Crane, being a celebrity on a hit television comedy, immediately made women feel at ease. He was handsome and likable, whereas Carpenter on his own would not have been able to attract nearly as many women. Crane had celebrity on his side. He wasn't just an actor on a show, he was the star of that show. And he was in everyone's living room once a week, from 1965 to 1971. They felt like they knew him, and if Carpenter was part of the deal, women felt he had to be okay if Bob Crane was vouching for him. Hollywood has long been a land of hypocritical values and virtues. Bob Crane was not the first actor to present an image the public loved, while in private indulging in some of the most deviant behaviors. In fact, if the general population had any idea what some of their favorite TV and movie stars got up to behind closed doors, much of Hollywood would have shut down years ago. The Hollywood sex scandal was not a new genre in Tinseltown. It had been destroying careers since the 1920s, taking down such stars as comedy giant Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, Mary Miles Minter, and Mabel Normand for their association to murdered director William Desmond Taylor. Studio chiefs blacklisting the career of Broadway star and film villain Lionel Atwill after a grand jury indicted him for perjury for an alleged orgy held in his private residence, of which several of those same studio heads attended. The closets of Hollywood contained more skeletons than Forest Lawn Cemetery. Bob Crane was in good company, so long as the public never found out. During the run of Hogan's, Crane divorced his wife Ann of 21 years, with whom he had 3 children, and married Hogan's fellow cast member, Patricia Olson, who is better known under her stage name, Sigrid Valdis. The wedding took place on the Hogan set. How the network and Bing Crosby Productions approved of this type of publicity of a man leaving his wife and children for another woman was typically out of step with traditional family values. As Hogan's Heroes came to a close in 1971, Bob Crane's options for the movies had become extremely limited, and he attempted to keep himself in play by making guest appearances on other television series. Nothing close to a solid regular role, just some hit-and-miss parts on some shows like Love American Style, The Doris Day Show, Rod Serling's Night Gallery. However, in 1973, he got a break, and Disney came calling with a movie where he would be the title star. Superdad was a generation gap comedy in which Crane's character's daughter is in love with Bart, Kurt Russell, someone in Crane's character's eyes as less than ideal for his daughter. But in order to try and show his daughter he's a hip dad and he's with it, he tries to endear himself to her and her friends. Of course, he only ends up embarrassing himself and his daughter in a series of slapstick misadventures. Unfortunately for Crane, he and the film became an abject failure. Superdad crashed and burned at the box office, and not to the displeasure of Disney. As it was alleged, the front office was not happy with some of Bob's usual late-night antics during production. Letting the film collect dust on the Disney shelves wasn't such a bad thing after all. For the next 2 years, Crane would make minor guest appearances on Policewoman, the game show Tattletales, while traveling the country doing dinner theater in order to support himself. The stage play was Beginner's Luck, a typical sex comedy which were quite popular during the 1970s. The show was put together right after the cancellation of Hogan's in 1971 and originally starred both Bob and his wife Patty Olson. But trying to perform a show and look after a toddler became too much for them both. It was decided she would return to California to focus on raising their child, and Bob would continue doing the show as it was primarily his name that was bringing in audiences. 5 years into traveling with Beginner's Luck and a guest television appearance here and there, NBC announced a new sitcom for its 1975 spring-summer season entitled The Bob Crane Show. Once again, Bob not only had a starring role in a sitcom, but his name was the show's title as well. Things did seem to be finally looking good again for Bob Crane. Sadly, after 14 weeks, NBC pulled the plug on Bob's new show. The ratings just weren't there, and Bob would have to return to dinner theater yet again. But the following year, Disney would call again in 1976 for their film Gus. Ironically, his role as Pepper, the football announcer in Gus, was just about the only breath of fresh air this stinker of a film would desperately need. This would not only prove to be his last association with Disney, but it would be his final film role. 1976 would prove to keep Crane busy in television, making appearances on Ellery Queen, Joe Forrester, Gibbsville, to which in 1977 he only made 2 appearances on television, Quincy M.E. and the Hardy Boys' Nancy Drew Mysteries. This could be due in large to the theater commitments with Beginner's Luck, but it was sadly obvious that Hollywood was calling Bob Crane less and less, and in 1978 he made only 1 appearance on TV, and that was on The Love Boat, Season 1, Episode 13. I think one has to realize that when you're reduced to being a filler name on a show that likes to rely on an all-star cast, but when the casts are made up from canceled television shows, it looks more like the line at the Hollywood unemployment office than it does when your name is the show. For Crane, who called himself forever an optimist, he just figured that something would turn up. In the meantime, he'd stick with a steady paycheck on the road with Beginner's Luck. But luck was something Bob Crane was quickly running out of. In 1978, Scottsdale, Arizona was still considered to residents that lived there as a small town. There was low crime, safe neighborhoods, and murder was not part of their normal, everyday landscape. The thought that someone could be beaten to death in their community, let alone a Hollywood celebrity, was more than shocking news. As police are called to the scene, it became evident that they were already in over their heads. After realizing that not only did they have a bludgeoned celebrity on their hands, but they were also surrounded by a room of private pornography. As detectives attempted to assess their crime scene, the biggest question on their minds wasn't who murdered Bob Crane, it was where to begin. The Scottsdale Police Department was not equipped to handle this kind of murder. They were more used to traffic violations, petty theft, and the occasional assault. As they took in the Crane crime scene, the thought of having to go through every single videotape and photograph to potentially try and track down each of the women in the photos and tapes was a daunting task even for the most experienced of police departments. Was all of this pornography really Colonel Hogan? Was Bob Crane really the kind of guy who engaged in kinky orgy sex acts and videotaping his conquests? Surely this all had to be a mistake. But truth is often stranger than fiction. As police examine the crime scene, the one thing that particularly is absent in a murder this violent is that the apartment, while cluttered, showed no signs of any type of struggle. And even Crane's body had the look of him of being in a comfortable slumber. Detectives must try and ascertain, did the killer simply walk in from the street? Victoria Berry found the door unlocked, and according to Berry, Bob always kept his apartment locked due to fear of theft. Did the killer have a key? Did Crane let the killer in? Or had the killer returned to the apartment with him that night? The position of his body proved he had been asleep at the time of the murder. In fact, he most likely, for lack of a better term, never knew what hit him. They discovered that the cord tied around his neck has been cut from one of the video cassette recorders in the living room. What did this mean? It seemed to be very much an afterthought, a statement of some kind, that the killer was making it clear the videos had something to do with the murder. Was there something incriminating on one of those tapes? Was the tape in question missing? How would they know? How do you catalog a crime scene such as this, especially when it comes to content that's so secretive from the beginning? The eternal question now for detectives was motive. What is it? Who had the most to gain or lose from the death of Bob Crane? Robert Crane Jr. has stated in his book, Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder, he felt the person who had the most to gain from his father's death was his stepmother, Patricia Olson. The two of them were in the middle of a very bitter divorce at that time, and Crane Jr. claimed his father had changed his will several years previously, that in the result of his death, only Patricia Olson and their son Scotty would benefit from Crane's estate. His 3 children from his first marriage had already been written out. In fact, 10 days before his death, Patricia Olson and their son showed up at his door in Arizona on Father's Day, much to the chagrin of Crane. Robert Crane Jr. stated that it was a very uncomfortable day and a half of them being there. He goes on to say he felt her presence being there was in order to get the layout of the apartment, perhaps gaining information she might need to pass along to someone else, someone she might hire to solve her problem for her. Police refute Olson as a suspect due to the fact that Crane had a telephone conversation with her on the day of his murder, with him in Arizona and her in Washington State. They were able to confirm toll charges and times and concluded there would be no way she could personally have been able to make the journey, commit the murder, and get back to Washington State in the time required. This does not rule out a contract hit. As we sifted through the research of potential suspects, we pushed aside the least likely, but did not rule them out. Least likely would be an angry husband, boyfriend, jealous woman, jilted lover, pregnant lover, mob hit, someone Crane owed money to. The reason why we dismissed these types of suspects were due to the crime scene. An angry husband or boyfriend would have gone through the apartment looking for any photos or tapes of his wife or girlfriend. While they could have attempted to be careful, the amount of adrenaline that would have been present after committing such a crime would have manifested itself with searching disarray, adding to the potential for leaving more blood evidence around the apartment. Case in point is there was a blood smear on the doorknob of the front door. Also, specks of blood on the curtains that faced the front of the apartment from the guest bedroom. Robert Graysmith suggested the killer may have been trapped inside the apartment after the murder due to the fact that people were in the parking lot preparing to move in that morning. One of those people made a statement to police that they saw a male walking away from the area of Crane's apartment and leave in a white car. There was a rumor that Crane had considered making a big-budget sex film with mob boss Dominic Brooklier, and Crane backed out. But there is no evidence of any such deal. In the initial investigation, it seems police were at a total loss of where to look or what to look for. And how would they know if anything was missing anyway, unless someone who knew what was there or was supposed to be there was no longer there? The robbery motive was immediately ruled out, as there was a great deal of expensive equipment. In fact, Bob was wearing an expensive French wristwatch, still in place when police examined his body. Soon their focus would turn to Bob's friend, John Carpenter. Carpenter was indeed in town, but had left and returned to California. Robert Crane Jr. remarked that he himself had received a phone call from Carpenter, informing him he was back from Arizona. According to author Robert Graysmith, who wrote the book, The Murder of Bob Crane, felt this was Carpenter's way of attempting to establish an alibi, making it known he was in California while Bob Crane's deceased body lay in the bedroom of his Winfield apartment. So is John Carpenter a viable suspect? What does he have to gain from the death of his friend? Again, citing Robert Crane Jr., he states that his father was making an attempt to remove certain people from his life at that time, Carpenter being one of them, referring to them as hangers-on, people who only associated with his father because he was a celebrity. In the film Autofocus by writer-director Paul Schrader, the centerpiece of the movie revolves around the relationship between Crane and Carpenter. There are hints that Carpenter was bisexual, and perhaps had even developed a fixation on Crane personally. That makes sense if Carpenter had some private emotional attachment to Crane. Now, if Crane had something on tape that could ruin John Carpenter professionally and personally, and was threatening to blackmail him with it in order to force him to get lost, that would certainly be motivation. It was learned that one of the photo albums was missing from the room. In fact, it was Carpenter who had brought it up to police. However, if blackmail were the case, Carpenter could have just as easily turned the table on Crane, who had much more to lose. We have to remember, while Bob Crane's inner circle of friends knew or suspected his secret lifestyle, he still had to hide it because the world would have been shocked. And when the truth did come out, the world was shocked. Now, the one question I do keep coming back to in regards to Carpenter is, if Bob was supposed to drive him to the airport the next morning and didn't show up, wouldn't that alone have been a cause for concern if Carpenter was innocent? Instead, Carpenter drives himself to the airport in a rental that he registers a complaint about the electrical. What puzzles me is, if he already had a rental car, why would he need Crane to take him to the airport in the first place? He wouldn't have arranged a rental car from his hotel in the middle of the night. He'd just call a cab. Was there something in one of those photo albums Carpenter needed to destroy? But if that was the case, why bring attention to it with the police? Police quickly narrowed their investigation down to only looking at John Carpenter as the murderer of Bob Crane. Eventually, the rental car was found and examined. Investigators did find small amounts of blood in the car, a smear on the inside door, and what appears to be an elongated droplet, and later what appeared to be a bit of subcutaneous matter. Naturally, in 1978, DNA wasn't an investigative technique, just blood typing, and the blood in the car did match Bob Crane's blood type. But it would have also matched anyone else with that same blood type. According to most statements, Crane didn't drink, yet bottles of alcohol were found in his apartment. Was this for guests? Robert Crane Jr. stated there was a 6-pack of beer in the apartment refrigerator, which he took from the crime scene. If Crane was indeed a non-drinker, the only reason for alcohol to be present in his apartment would be for guests. The case against John Carpenter was at best circumstantial. However, the biggest problem for police trying to link him to the murder was the crime scene was completely contaminated. All during the time investigators were there, Victoria Berry was there, answering the phone, smoking, walking around, touching things. The Scottsdale police, while attempting to diligently keep things in order, had to know the scene was compromised from the beginning. The major clues to Crane's murder were the bloody imprints on the bed of what was later to be determined the outline of a camera tripod and the VCR electrical cord tied around his neck. Two clues that both point to the videotaping. Police believe the cord in the tripod was Carpenter's signature to the murder. This is what brought us together. This is what will be the end of it, meaning Crane's death. Is it as simple as that? But again, I come back to the question, what did Carpenter have to gain from the death of Bob Crane? Then I thought instead, what was it that he had to lose? Carpenter was put on trial in 1994 and was acquitted of the murder. The case was completely circumstantial and no positive proof could ever be put at Carpenter's door. Carpenter died 4 years after his trial in September 1998. He was 70 years old. Patricia Olson, also known as Sigrid Valdis, inherited Bob Crane's estate as his widow, which according to Robert Crane Jr. was about $100,000 in cash and assets. She retired from acting after Hogan's, for which she hadn't had that much of a career in the first place. Her film and television credits are rather minuscule at best. For films, she appeared in 2 Tickets to Paris in 1962, for which she is uncredited, Marriage on the Rocks in 1965, Our Man Flint in 1966, The Venetian Affair in 1967, also with no credit. On television, she appeared in the Kraft Suspense Theater in 1964, 2 episodes of The Wild Wild West in 1965, a first appearance on Hogan's during the first season as Gretchen, and then as Hilda on Hogan's for 43 episodes from 1966 until the show ended in 1971. She remained Crane's wife until his death in 1978. In 2015, television news anchor John Hook met and interviewed with Robert Crane Jr. and realized nothing had been done with the case since Carpenter was acquitted in 1994. With the blessing of Crane's son, he took on the task of reinvestigating the case and was actually given access to the case files and blood samples to do an updated DNA test in hopes of determining that Carpenter was for certain Crane's killer. On live television in 2017, the results were read on the air with Carpenter's attorney present via satellite, Bob Crane Jr., one of the jurors, along with the prosecuting attorney. Together they learned the blood evidence found on John Carpenter's rental car was not Bob Crane's. What say you? Was Patricia Olson or John Carpenter behind the murder of Bob Crane? Or is the actual killer still out there? What became of the missing photo album? If it wasn't destroyed, perhaps one day it may show up in the attic or basement of someone's house. Someone we'd least likely to suspect of murder. Patricia Olson died of lung cancer in October of 2007. She was 72. She's buried next to her husband, Bob Crane, at the Westwood Memorial Park Cemetery under her stage name, with her and Bob's image as their characters from the show with the inscription, Hogan and Hilda, together, forever. Late into our investigation, we discovered that there were 2 very similar murders committed at the time Bob Crane was killed. Just 9 days before his death, Patty Kerger, a 30-year-old single mother, was beaten and stabbed multiple times in a vacant lot not far from Crane's apartment. And on August 27th, just under 2 months after Crane, Ken Avenire, a 25-year-old man, was beaten and also stabbed multiple times at the Sunburst Resort, where John Carpenter had stayed, which is less than a 6-minute walk from Crane's apartment. Is it possible that Bob Crane was actually the victim of a serial killer, and perhaps the killer didn't even realize who he had murdered until after the fact? Police claim the murders were in no way connected to the Crane homicide, yet all 3 cases remain cold to this day. With this new information, we will continue to investigate the murder of Bob Crane.